again with the Texas Historical Commission. Welcome to another episode in our Training for Texas Museums series. It's a project that's partially funded through a generous grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Today we're going to talk about exhibit labels, and specifically what makes good exhibit labels good. I've seen some that are not as good in my travels throughout Texas and in visiting some of the history museums that we have. And I think there are some really easy tips that can help people really boost the effectiveness and the engagement factor on their exhibit labels. So let's talk a little bit about some of those. Tip number 1, less is more, almost always. Studies tell us that visitors are more likely to stop and read shorter exhibit labels than they are longer exhibit labels. And they're also more likely to more thoroughly read shorter labels than they are the long ones. And that's the whole point, right? We want people to actually stop, actually read, actually get the point that we're trying to make in those labels. So what that tells us is that we need to resist the temptation to put everything we know about a topic and about a subject on a label. They're not encyclopedia entries, they're not research papers. Great labels have fewer words and they make the most impact. Good labels use paragraphs that are 25 to 75 words long. Good labels have 1 or 2 paragraphs on them, but that's not to say that if you can say what you need to say in 10 words or less, you don't need to take a full 25 words to say it. If you can say it in 10 words, do it. Another good strategy is to chunk the information that you have on your labels. And all that means is that if you have a paragraph that is 75 words long, instead of making it a single paragraph, try to break it up into 2 separate paragraphs that are like 40 words or less long. That just looks easier to read, and because it looks easier to read, more people are actually going to stop and actually read the label. So the less is more philosophy works with the number of labels that you have in any particular section of your museum as well. We call that the density of labels. If you overdo it, folks are likely to kind of look around and say, there's no way I can read all of these exhibit labels, or no way that I want to read all of these labels, so I'm just not going to read any of them. So less is more. Tip number 2. You really want to engage your reader. You've gotten them to stop and read your labels, so now you want to reward them with something that is not boring. You want to give them interpretation and not just information. You want to draw them in, pique their interest, help them discover more than just facts. Be provocative in your writing. You can start by using the active voice rather than the passive voice. You can use really powerful verbs and adjectives. You can also use plain and straightforward language. You want to keep the vocabulary simple, and you want to avoid using any kind of technical terms or jargon. And if you have to use those things, you want to make sure that you define them. It's easier to stay engaged, as you know, if you don't have to work too hard to follow the logic or to follow the story or to follow the narrative. So keeping that in mind, use simple sentences. Avoid using compound or complex sentences, except for in really rare occasions. Now, everything that your reader reads, of course, everything that the visitor reads needs to come back to your big idea, needs to support that take-home message that you're trying to convey. Tip number 3, your labels should give your visitors something to do. You want them to do something as a result of reading your label, and it can be something like agree or disagree with a statement. It can be test a hypothesis. It can be form a conclusion. It can be encouraging them to look more closely at an object or at an image, something along those lines. Now, obviously, not every label can have people doing something as a result of reading it. That would just be exhausting, but you need to have at least a few of those sprinkled throughout your exhibit. Tip number 4, make your labels easy to read. So you've worked on, cutting the number of words, you've worked on writing more engagingly. That's hard work, so don't let it go to waste by writing your label in font that's this big, okay? And you might think that's obvious, but you would be surprised at how many old, like 3x5 index cards I've encountered, where the text is actually typed out with a typewriter. They're really hard to see. And, technology has advanced to the point where you can print out some really effective, really attractive labels using the word processing program that came with your computer and a desktop printer. So do it. You want to use a nice, large, simple font. You want to keep it to 1 or 2 types of font per label. Any more than that can get distracting to your visitor, to your reader. You want to use dark letters on a light background. That's the easiest for them to see. Black text on white background is perfectly fine. And as far as placement goes, you want to make it easy to read by putting it at a height that's not too high and not too low. You don't want your visitor to have to strain their neck as they try to read your labels. You also need to be aware that you might have to angle your labels a bit in order to aid the reading. Sometimes flat against a wall is difficult to read. So if you have something up a little bit higher, you might have to angle it down. And if you have something a little lower, you might need to angle it up. And that can help people read your labels more easily. And remember that not everything has to be flat on a wall or flat in a case. And lastly, make it easy to read by being really aware of the surface. Try to avoid glossy surfaced labels, and if you're putting them under glass or behind glass, make sure that you test all of the different angles that someone might read them from to make sure that the glare, it doesn't make it difficult for the visitor to read your label. And tip number 5, put the labels where they're easy to find. Again, studies show us that labels that are above our normal line of sight don't get noticed, and if they don't get noticed, they don't get read. Similarly, if you have a label that's about a particular object or a particular image, the label needs to go as close to that image as possible. The farther you put it away, the less likely people are to seek that label out, and if they don't seek it out, they can't read it. So, exhibit labels really can make or break an exhibit. If you think your labels might need a makeover, I've got some suggestions for some resources that can help. The first one is Exhibit Labels, An Interpretive Approach by Beverly Sorrell. This book covers everything from developing the big idea, which we didn't talk about today, and it's really very important, to learning style and visitor behaviors, but then it also gets into the nitty-gritty of how many paragraphs, how many words, what color should the font be, what kind of font should I use, what kind of background. It's really a go-to reference for all things label related. A second source is Interpretive Writing, which is by Alan Leftridge. This one isn't label specific, but it's a really, really good small volume on interpretive writing in general, and I think you might be able to use it for all kinds of projects in your museum. And then the third resource is online. The American Association of Museums has a curators committee, and every year they sponsor a competition that's called the Excellence in Exhibition Label Writing. And it's a really, really good way for you to see the best examples of label writing from across the country. They feature the winners each year on their website, so you should definitely go and check that out. And we'll give you a link at the end of this episode. So remember, it doesn't matter if the budget for your next exhibit is $50 or $50,000. You can write good, effective, attractive labels. They're definitely in your reach. For more information or to contact us, you can visit our website, www.thc.state.tx.us.